Welcome everyone to the first Sylvius lecture since the pandemic struck. And we're honoured to have Professor Robin Dunbar from the University of Oxford and Emeritus Fellow at Magdalen College. So I'm a postdoc working with Laura Steenbergen on gut-brain interactions. And I invited Robin to speak, having worked in his group at Oxford, firstly with a project on human social networks and the endorphin system, and also my PhD on the gut microbiome, the brain and social behaviour. His social and evolutionary neuroscience research group was very exciting to be part of. As you'll hear today, his research spans so many different areas that it's hard to do his research career justice in a brief intro like this. Robin's primary interest is in understanding the behavioural, cognitive, and neuroendocrinological mechanisms that underpin social bonding in humans and other primates. His research findings led him to famously coin Dunbar's number, which you might well have heard of. It's used to describe the number of friends that we can cognitively maintain. As well as real-life interactions, Robin's research has also extended into understanding the role that online networks and social media play in human social relationships. Among his many awards are the Huxley Memorial Medal and Fellowship of British Academy, the Association of Psychological Science, and the Royal Anthropological Institute. And in this era of unprecedented social isolation and virtual interactions, I'm sure his talk will be more pertinent than ever before. So without any further ado, the Zoom stage is yours, Professor Dunbar.
Thank you very much, Katerina. I'll go straight to screen sharing. So I'm going to talk really on a grand scale rather than perhaps the more conventional small scale that most science research tends to focus on. I tend to look at the big picture and try to fit together a very big jigsaw puzzle. It's kind of, life is kind of more fun when you do that. It's also rather risky because most of the time you're an amateur peering in at other people's research. But what I'm going to talk about is really the picture of friendship that we've arrived at, not only its function, although I won't particularly say very much about that at all today, but the mechanisms that are involved in allowing us to manage large numbers of friends and essentially how that builds into the creation of communities. But let me just start out by pointing out that primates really are very odd in many ways. They have a very distinctive style of sociality, which is based on bonded relationships. So these very intense, emotionally intense social relationships, which are quite different to the patterns we see in most of the other birds and mammals. So up here on the top right is the distribution of brain size, essentially, in this case, relative brain size for different primate species that have different mating or social systems rather than mating systems. And there's a general trend that you can see here for brain size effectively to increase as you move from solitary to monogamous harem-based social systems out to these very large multi-male, multi-female groups that some species have. And that pattern is very different to what you see over here on the left among some representative mammals, carnivores, artiodactyls, that's to say the ungulates, the bats, and even among the birds. Here, what's interesting is this big brains that are associated with pair-bonded monogamy in all these groups, with large kind of multi-male, multi-female groups tending to have relatively small brains by comparison. So this difference really reflects the fact that these pair-bonded relationships are cognitively costly, and what primates seem to have done is use that mechanism to create what amounts to friendships with large numbers of other individuals with whom they are not, as we might say, romantically engaged, what in effect we mean by friendships. And this then kind of expresses itself in what's known as the social brain hypothesis. And in this quantitative form, it only occurs in the primates, the monkeys and apes, essentially, and the prosimians. we used to kind of, well, I suppose the social brain hypothesis originally came about, not my idea originally, as an explanation for why primates have particularly big brains compared to all these other groups of mammals and birds. And the argument was that they live in very complex social systems, though we didn't really understand at that stage how complex they actually are. And therefore they need a big computer to manage that kind of ongoing dynamic world in which they live in their social groups. So we assumed originally that this was a single linear relationship. Everybody fell on the same thing, but we've discovered, well, we've kind of known about it for about 20 years. But it's taken us 20 years to figure out how to actually show this. That what you actually have in this relationship is 4 separate grades here. And these grades differ in the degree of bondedness within the social groups, the complexity, the social complexity of the groups, the cognitive capacities that underpin them, and also in turn in group size. So these are increasing steadily as you go from left to right. These here are the apes, but most of these are a mixture of kind of old world monkeys, new world monkeys, and prosimians. So the apes are the only group that are taxonomically homogeneous, if you like. So the issue really, and we've known about this for a long time, but apparently lots of other people haven't, is that it's really important if you're going to make predictions about the size of social groups that other species or any species, living species or a fossil species even live in, then you have to be able to put them into the right grade. It's no good using the general relationship, because if you do that, you will underestimate quite radically the predicted social group size. That's known as Simpson's paradox, and it's a version of the ecological fallacy. And it's very common in sociology, or it's where it was originally first discovered. But since we're apes, we know where to put ourselves. We sit on this right-hand side line here with the other apes. And if we stick our brain size in here, we get this prediction of a group size of about 150. I hasten to say I didn't name it Dunbar's number. I think it was named Dunbar's number on Facebook, that well-known emporium of science. But there we go. Question is, do people really live in groups of that size? The answer is yes. And I'll just show you a little bit of the data we have. These are data from a single mobile phone provider in one European country, and it's a large European country at that. So it's about 20% of the entire population, something like 6 million subscribers. And these data are based on 6 billion phone calls made by these 6 million subscribers over the course of a year. The sort of yellow mess here, which is individual dots of these 6 million subscribers, are the number of people they called on a regular basis and who called them back. Our criterion was they had to call somebody and be called back, or the other way around, before it was counted as a relationship. And of course, we also removed all the kind of business type numbers insofar as one can do. And physicists are very good at doing that kind of filtering these days. So these are pretty much individuals. And we know who many of these people are because we know who the numbers are. We know they're associated with a particular location and so on. And here's the distribution. This is on a log scale. You can see, or at least on a log scale, it's very bell-shaped. On an ordinary scale, of course, you've got this very long tail out to the right. It doesn't quite go out to 10,000 very often, but the peak is right in the middle here at about 145. And that size of grouping just turns up all over the place. Here are some other examples. Up at the top here is the average size of weddings over the course of an entire decade in the whole of the USA. So it's a huge database that we were able to find. It's the same size of grouping you find in hunter-gatherer communities. Sometimes they're called the organizational level known as clans. They don't necessarily all live together, but they're the people that belong to, if you like, a territorial group. We have two very nice historical databases. One is from the Domesday Book, which William the Conqueror, the Norman conqueror, undertook as a major census of England and Wales, his new country he captured, if you like, occupied. And they recorded absolutely everything in detail. The only thing they didn't record was the number of people, but they recorded every house, every plough, every horse, every pig, every field, and so on. And the historians have worked out what the village sizes were. And the average village size was almost exactly 150 in every single county in England. And there's a very nice Italian database which runs across about 800 years of a particular area in the Alps, the village sizes there. So you can see the population increasing, but village sizes are remaining robustly somewhere around 150 to 175 in size. So kind of overall, these two data sets come out with an average of 150. And then last but not least, at least in this particular sample, if you look at the size of military groups, armies all over the world, all modern armies have very similar structure. And the core basic unit is the company. And the company varies in size from about 120 to about 200 at the largest, but has an average across that of very close to 150. And what's important about the company is they're very much like these kind of hunter-gatherer organizations, in that everybody knows everybody else, and they act in the way they do because of their sense of personal obligation to the other members of their company. Whereas that's not the case at higher levels of organization, of battalions or regiments or whatever. So this is a very robust effect. I think we have something like 25 online and offline data samples now for this. Like the biggest of the lot was published in 2012. It's not one of our data sets. It was 61 million Facebook users, and their average number of friends on Facebook was 149. So I think I can no longer need to obtain any more samples with that. What's interesting about this effect, though, you might think of it in terms of a cross-species effect, the social brain, but in fact, actually, it turns out to be apply within species too. So there've been something in the order of 20 neuroimaging studies now over the last 10 years, which have shown that the size of your friendship circle measured in some well, a variety of ways, everything from, how many shoulders to cry on friends do you have, up to how many friends do you have on Facebook, have shown that these, and it doesn't seem to matter for reasons which will become apparent in a minute, perhaps. It doesn't seem to matter which you use, but these correlate across individuals with the size, particularly of what's turned out to be the default mode network as conventionally understood. Was originally thought of in terms of the mentalizing network, because the people who did most of these studies were studying theory of mind and the like. But since then, it's become apparent that this really is just the default mode network. And it really ties in very tightly to not only the size of these individual units in there, so particularly up in the prefrontal cortex, but also the temporal parietal junction and then the temporal lobe, but also with this massive white fiber connections that go between them. And then in addition to that, there's a loop that comes down from particularly the orbital frontal prefrontal cortex going down into the limbic system, which seems to be tied into that as well. So this is a very strong effect. It's been seen in a number of different studies. It's now also been shown for two species of old world monkeys, macaques and baboons. And it turns out that this really is a mentalizing network, so it's involved heavily in things like mentalizing and other forms of social reasoning. So these are just two of our studies. This is a large-scale parcellation, stereological parcellation analysis, looking at which bits of the frontal lobe are the important bits. And this is a classic voxel-based morphometry study. We've also, with one of the other groups at Oxford, tried to look at some of the pathways involved in that. So this is a diffusion MRI study combined with a voxel-based morphometry study of grey matter that was run by Mary Ann Noonan. And again, this shows very nicely that the white matter tracts in there really crucial to this whole thing. So the volumes of the grey matter tracts and the white matter tracts correlate very strongly with the number of friends that you actually have. So there you are in your little social world of 150 people, give or take or two. I should say that this is the 150 is an average, so it's quite a lot. Well, as you could see from the telephone data, there's quite a range of variation here. You know, there's some people that don't have many friends, that's people like me, and there's some people that have loads of friends, that's people like Katerina that sit up here. There's a big range of variation in there. And we know what a lot of that is due to. Partly it's a sex difference, although not so much at this end of the spectrum, the total network size. Part of it's due to personality. Part of it's due to just opportunity. If you're an immigrant, as we've shown in one study, your possibilities for building an extended network are very limited, and therefore you have rather a small network. It gives it a completely different structure as well, which is kind of interesting. But however big it is, it's not an anonymous, amorphous social world like the picture on the left. It's much more clumpy. It looks much more like this. And in fact, if you look at the patterns of interaction involved, or the patterns of contact, say on Facebook or on telephone databases, frequency that people contact each other, what emerges very clearly from this is a series of layers of increasing size but decreasing intensity. Now, each layer includes the layer inside it, so it's kind of a hierarchically inclusive. So the 15 here includes the 5 people in here. It's not an additional 15 people, it's an additional 10 people. But the size of these layers have, or sizes of these layers have very distinctive scaling ratio. That is, each layer is about 3 times the size of the layer inside it. And we know that, so your 150 is divided into 5 layers, really, running out to 150. And then there's a kind of barrier at the red line, which demarcates the difference between people you will be very willing to help out if they ask you to help out. That's people inside the 150, from those who are outside the 150, whom you're a little bit more careful about giving them help in case they don't pay you back, obviously. But we know that this layering extends for at least 3 more layers. So there's a layer at 500, there's a layer at 1500, and a couple of years ago, some psychophysicists showed that there's another layer at 5000, which I think is, or we think is the outside one. The layer at 1.5 is quite amusing, really, because we didn't know it existed. And when I was giving lectures, I say, well, just look at this pattern here. There must be a layer missing. And if you backtrack by this scaling ratio of 3, you get to a layer size of 1.5. And of course, everybody would say, well, how can you have 1.5 friends? And the answer, of course, is it's made up, it's an average. Half the population has 1 close, very close friend, and the other half has 2. And I used to joke that that must be the difference between men and women, that men being less social can only cope with 1 intimate relationship at a time, and women being much more social, socially skilled, can manage 2. And not really expecting it actually existed. And then my Italian collaborators showed that this number, this actual grouping size really did exist in Facebook data and other digital data. And it did indeed turn out to be the difference between men and women. And that's because women have this phenomenon of a best friend forever, a BFF, that men don't have. Men have a romantic partner or a BFF, but not both, whereas women maintain the 2 simultaneously. So we can put kind of names then to these layers to give them some sense of reality. We think of this 500 layers as the layer of acquaintances. So a lot of these are people you work with, perhaps, or the barista you buy your coffee from every morning on the way to work, in the days when you went to work, and whom you might have a brief chat and kind of know well, but you kind of wouldn't invite those people back to your home for perhaps your big party. This 150 layer we sort of equated really with your kind of weddings, bar mitzvahs and funerals layer. They're the people who feel a sense of obligation to you. They will turn up on those once in a lifetime events, as it were. 1500 layer is simply people whose faces you can put names to, and whether you like it or not, you all have lovely Mr. Donald Trump in that layer, whether you like him or not, because if you saw him in the street, you'd recognize him instantly. He wouldn't know who you are there. So we're now into one directional relationships. And then beyond that, there's this layer of 5,000, which is people who, if you see their face or a photograph of their face, you know whether you've seen them before or not. Are they complete strangers, or are they kind of part of your social world? Now that whole setup, at least out to 150 layer, is evenly split between family and friends. In small scale societies, it would all be family. That's the nature of hunter-gatherer communities. But with our smaller family sizes, what we ended up with, once you've included your extended family, we've ended up with some empty slots, and what we've done is essentially fill them with friends who kind of, in a way, substitute as pseudo family. But the layers are created by the frequencies with which you interact with people. So these are data from one of our network studies, which was 50% women from, it's all women's networks in this particular case. It was half from UK women and half from Belgian women. And it's just the overall average. And what's plotted here is simply the rate of contact per day per person in each of the layers. So here are the layers down at the bottom here, running from 5 layer out to the 500 layer, the acquaintances layer, and the rate of contact here, that's 0, that's 0.4 contacts per day. So these people in the this layer here, the 5 layer, you're seeing every other day on average. And those frequencies are extremely robust. We see them not just in these are actually face-to-face data, but we also see exactly the same numbers in telephone data and in Facebook data. So if you look at the structure of these layers in the way we've done, we're looking at using clustering techniques to try and find out what the optimal patterns are. We typically get between 4 and 5. So these are data from individuals, as it were. And by far the commonest are a 4 or a 5 layer structure. What that gives you is something that looks like this. Here's our face-to-face data. This is based mostly on those women's networks. And then we have 3 digital data sets, if you like, all very large indeed. A Facebook data set, which we didn't get from Cambridge Analytica. This is actually a publicly available Facebook data set from 2009, known as the New Orleans data set. A Twitter data set, which my Italian collaborators crawled from Twitter, which is clearly an open source access, and then our cell phone data set from this one EU country. And you can see the patterns are very, very similar. Now, what's remarkable about this is if you look at the structure of primate groups, and indeed the distribution of group sizes across species, you see exactly the same pattern. So these are the if you like, the commonest grouping sizes that you see in primates. You see a cluster at around about 2, 2.5, a cluster at about 5, a cluster at about 15, and a cluster about 50. They don't go beyond that. It's only humans that go beyond that. And then you see within these big groups, you see these layers forming again. So this is an extremely robust pattern. So my other physicist collaborators in America have shown a couple of years ago that 150 is actually a convergence point. It's an attractor at which the flow of information is optimized. If you drop away from it, or you on either side, then the flow of information drops considerably. And we think that probably each of these layers is a kind of harmonic attractor underneath that. Okay, what's also interesting about these data is that they threw up the fact that we have a kind of social fingerprint. So this was done by looking at how people rank their various friends and family in their social network, and how often they actually phoned them in this particular case. And these were all young adults in this particular study. And what's shown here is the distribution for two individuals, one's male and the other's female, across 3 time spans that were covering 18 months. The yellow dotted line in each case is the average for the entire data set. And what I just want you to see is, first of all, how different these two are in the way they distribute their time and effort, and therefore their emotional closeness, because the two are highly correlated, but also how consistent they are over time. We've shown this consistency with several other data sets since then, but this kind of sense that you have a kind of social fingerprint or social signature in the way you distribute your time and effort is really quite remarkable. And what's interesting about that is what happens if you drop a friend out because you fall out with them, then when you replace them with somebody else, you put them into exactly the same slot of contact frequency as the one who was thrown out. So the question at this point is really, well, how are these social groupings maintained? The answer is we do it in exactly the same way as all the monkeys and apes do. And what they have is a classic dual process mechanism. That's to say, there are two quite separate behavioral and processes going on, which are supported by two different neural mechanisms within the brain, but they work in very close tandem to each other, and both are important. If you only have one, you kind of won't have full-blown social networks in the way you would if you have both of them operating together. Now, one of those is a consequence of this stuff here, social grooming. Grooming for monkeys and apes is an incredibly intense, especially for the very social species, very intense, very concentrated. They spend a lot of time grooming each other. In fact, the most social species like these baboons at the top here, can devote 20% of their entire day to grooming each other in this way. And there is a general relationship between group size and the time that a species, or the typical group size, and the time a species spends grooming. So the bigger the groups, the more grooming they end up doing in order to bond their relationships within. Grooming turns out, and we've known about this since about the 80s really, to trigger the endorphin system in the brain. If you block it, animals will just persistently try and get grooming, request grooming constantly, because they're not getting their kind of endorphin hit, if you like. But what this seems to do is set up a kind of psychopharmacological platform of which a kind of cognitive relationship can then be built. And that cognitive component relates directly to brain size and the underpinning cognition. And what it's doing is essentially creating relationships of trust and obligation and reciprocity, basically. And it creates these very intense bonds where individuals go out of their way to make sure they stay together during the day's foraging. Well, just to show you that this really does work in humans too, this is one of our PET scanning studies that was carried out by our collaborators in Finland, in which we put a bunch of people, as it happens for the usual reasons with imaging, we only put males into the scanners, and then we had their partners stroking them on the torso, so not allowed to go above the neck or below the belt. So it's just on the chest and stomach, like very gentle stroking. And here is a composite of their brains absolutely firing up, and you can see how massive the effect is up here in the prefrontal cortex, and also along the routings into the temporoparietal junction and so on. And conversely, how empty the occipital lobe is at the back here, down here, which of course is just devoted to vision. So there's absolutely no reason why it should be involved. But the brain is clearly being flooded with endorphins, and there are endorphin receptors absolutely everywhere. And this speaks to, in fact, the fact that, well, you know, we do enjoy going to the hairdressers and having our fur stroked, as it were, as the hairdresser or the barber goes about their business, and we find it very relaxing. But also we do a lot of these kind of things like stroking and patting and hugging and so on, which are moving the mechanisms or triggering the system to release endorphins in the brain. And that in itself is a consequence of a highly specialized neural system, which we've only known about for about 15 years at most. So if you look at the peripheral nerve system, you have the classic sort of pain nerves, and most of the other nerves work in a very similar way. You've got a very fast myelinated nerve that runs up into the somatosensory cortex and then sends a return loop back to the muscles. You know? So if you stick your hand in the fire, the brain goes, ouch, and immediately sends a signal very extremely fast back down to the muscles saying, for God's sakes, pull your hand away. These fibers that seem to be involved in stroking and grooming are very, very different. These are the afferent C-tactile fiber system. They are unmyelinated, so they're extremely slow by neural standards. They go up into the insular cortex rather than the somatosensory cortex, and the insular is heavily involved in the endorphin system, or triggering the endorphin system. And there is no return loop, right? So there's no motor loop coming back from the brain. It's just one way. And they're also highly, highly specialized. They respond only to one signal, and that is light, slow stroking at a very specific speed. That's 3 centimeters a second. So if you stroke somebody slower than that or faster than that, the neurons don't fire at all. They're just completely quiet. But if you hit 3 centimeters a second, they go crazy. And we've shown, my collaborators who've done a lot of the work on this stuff have shown that if you stroke babies that are fretful and crying at exactly 3 centimeters a second on the skin, it calms them down. If you stroke them at 30 centimeters a second, it doesn't. There's no response at all. So these are highly specialized systems designed to, in fact, trigger the endorphin system as a result of the mechanical effect of hand movements on the skin surface. And just to sort of indicate how important touch really is to us, despite the fact that it tends to go on below the sort of consciousness horizon, as it were, so we don't really think about it. But these are data which we've collected from, again, with my Finnish collaborators. And the data are collected from all over Europe, so east to west and north to south, Finland in the north to Italy in the south, and the UK in the west to Russia in the east, but also in a follow-up study in Japan as well. Basically, we get the same picture. So this is the front of the individual, this is the back, and this is the identity of the person. So we're asking them, think of your partner, think of your best friend, think of your brother, an uncle, whatever. Where would you be comfortable touching them on the body, painted in, or comfortable about them touching you? And the lighter it is, the more comfortable you are. The blacker it is, the darker the color of the red, or especially the black, the least comfortable you are. And two things are interesting here, I think. One is how consistent these patterns are across all these different cultures, including Japan. The patterns are very, very similar. Yes, okay, you know, the Italians are a bit more effusive and huggy and so on than the sort of Northern Europeans. But I hasten to point out that the most touchy-feely people in Europe are actually the Finns, of all people. And the difference really from Europe to Japan was very modest indeed, just minor details here and there. But secondly, the extent to which you're willing to allow people to sort of hug you or pat you or stroke you declines steadily. And once you get past cousins, really, it starts to get to the point where you're not very happy about it, except for the hands. That's why, you know, handshakes are okay, but don't come any closer to me. So it's just a reminder of how important touch actually is in our social lives. Well, I've really expressed this all in terms of the endorphin system, but of course, lots of people have suggested alternative neuroendocrines that might be involved. And we became a bit frustrated by this, partly because what tended to happen is you kind of had people who favored one neuroendocrine over all the others and never mentioned anything else. So there's the kind of the big divide is probably the oxytocin lovers, as it were, who just do experiments on oxytocin and never consider anything else. And then there's a small minority of people who spend a lot of time doing beta endorphin, but kind of ignore oxytocin. So we thought, well, you know, and also on top of that, we kind of became increasingly conscious that there was a tendency, particularly for the oxytocin studies, to focus on dyadic relationships, and particularly on romantic partnerships. That's partly because the oxytocin story came out of the vole studies, monogamous versus polygamous, promiscuous voles. But there, you know, our world isn't strictly dyadic in that sense. This is the economist's view of the world, is how we put it. The world consists only of two kinds of individuals, you or somebody else, unspecified, and your relationship really is a trading relationship. And so kind of most of the oxytocin stuff has been done either on strangers or on people you have very, very intense relationships with, and completely ignored the fact that these dyadic relationships are embedded in a wider network, social network, your social world. And at the other end, there are major issues about the kind of social predisposition you have. People differ in how warm and friendly they are. And we've shown that, for example, your attachment style correlates with the endorphin receptor density, particularly in the front end of the brain. So we did this enormous genetic study in which we obtained spit samples from a very large sample of people and assayed them for 35 SNPs associated with the receptors of these 6 neuroendocrines. And we threw in everything that anybody had said might be interesting. And here's the picture we got. So this is looking at the allele differences and their association with various measures of these 3 different types of sociality. And you can see here, some of them are pretty uninteresting. Testosterone doesn't go much further than kind of determining whether the red mist rises or not, probably within your brain, but nowhere else. Beyond that, serotonin seems to have rather a limited focus, perhaps appearing up here in the wider network. But these are the 2 that make the big difference. You can see oxytocin here that's focused on dyadic relationships. But what's interesting about these data is actually that almost vanished if you factored endorphin into the statistical analysis, into the equation, reinforcing the fact that it's the kind of dopamine endorphin system that is probably most important in managing relationships. And this is really why we focus strongly on the endorphin side. This probably gives you the kind of the excitement part of the relationship, but this produces the enduring and long-lasting bedrock on which long-term and lifelong relationships are built. And this is perhaps reflected in the difference in half-lives between these 2. The half-life in the blood and in the brain for oxytocin is measured in minutes, whereas that for endorphins measured in hours. So one of the arguments that people have got interested in endorphin is oxytocin just doesn't last long enough to create these lifelong relationships that you have in primates. It may be fine for voles, it may even be fine for ungulates and various species like that, and it clearly does something for us. But in terms of laying down the basis for lifelong relationships, you need something that's much more robust, and it's endorphin that's been pulled into provide that opportunity. So here, just to illustrate the attachment style data, two results from our studies of that, PET scan studies of that by, again, our collaborators in Finland. So these are the things firing up, but the key thing is this negative relationship here, both in the thalamus and particularly in the orbital frontal cortex. That really provides the strongest correlation with avoidance styles. So people who are kind of cold and offhand, like the British, have very low receptor density in the orbital frontal cortex for endorphins, and people who are kind of warm and cuddly, like the Italians, have orbital frontal cortex full of endorphin receptors. So the question then becomes, well, why is the social brain component so costly? I mean, brain matter is costly in itself, but then why do we prepare to pay that price? What's it doing for us? What we think is actually the issue is that we have to be able to, what we're doing is modeling other people's mental states. In effect, we're working with avatars we create in our own brain of the world out there. And that this kind of internal modeling depends on a number of core properties, cognitive properties, which are actually unique to the anthropoid primates. The prosimians don't have them, but the anthropoid primates do. And these are things like causal reasoning, analogical reasoning, one-trial learning, mentalizing, and particularly the inhibition of prepotent responses, so self-control. And here's the study we did looking at the neural cost, computational cost of mentalizing. So the contrast, this is a standard fMRI study, the contrast is between answering questions about the facts in a story, if you like, the physical facts in a story, and answering questions about the mental states of the individuals in the story. So the physical facts are, Jim and Peter went to the pub, let's say, whereas the mental states ones were, what was Jim thinking when he invited Peter to go to the pub? We're moving into a higher virtual reality at that point. And the key issue here is that the more mental states involved in a, well, first of all, there's a qualitative difference between thinking about mental states and thinking about factual components of what happened, with the first recruiting much more neural machinery, many more nerves, particularly in the mentalizing default mode network, but also there's a quantitative effect that's due to the number of mind states involved. So we're comparing the number of bits of information essentially in the factual story against the number of bits in the information in the mentalizing story, and the latter in terms of the number of mind states that the person is trying to think about. And as the difference increases dramatically as the number of mind states increases. Inhibition is very interesting and very important in this context. In fact, we kind of begin to think that this is the most important cognitive ability for the maintenance of primate-style social systems in many ways, because what it requires, what's crucial about these bonded social systems is keeping the group together as a unit. Now, if you look at most species like ungulates and so on, they form big herds, but the herds just kind of break up, fission over time as individuals just drift away from each other because one goes to rest when the other one carries on feeding. And to maintain these bonded social groups with the stable membership over time, over lifelong time, basically, primates need to be able to suppress that intention to carry on doing what they want to do when somebody else wants to do something different. In other words, they've got to be able to suspend the desire to feed if everybody else has gone to rest, or if everybody else has been resting and now starts feeding, they've got to suspend the desire to rest. And it turns out this ability to inhibit prepotent responses is unique to the anthropoid primates. None of the other species of mammals and birds actually show it. It's highly correlated with these other cognitive processes that I mentioned: causal reasoning, analogical reasoning, so on, the ability to compare two different outcomes and see what the options are. And they're tied into Brodmann area 10 up here in the frontal pole, tacked into the mode. You can see from here, these are data from two different inhibition tasks. Group size correlates with performance on both of these. Okay, so why is time important? Briefly think of that really in terms of the investment that you have to make. And just to show you how important that is, this is part of a long-term study over 18 months, looking at the change in emotional closeness when people move away from home. These are young adults moving away from home. Whoops. And you can see that even though they've moved away from their family, the average emotional closeness to the extended family, that's everybody, you know, aunties, uncles, everybody is very modest indeed. It doesn't really change much. But friendships drop away very, very fast. Within 6 months, you can already pick up a strong signature that that friendship has been reduced. So we can kind of just to kind of give you a sense of what the issue is here, but express the grooming demand in terms of the group sizes of fossil primates. And you can do that fairly easily by just interpolating through a series of regression equations from cranial volume through group size to grooming time. That's the picture we get. Here's the value we predict for modern humans. Over here, you can see these fossil modern humans fit very nicely at that level. Here's the upper limit for primates, and here's two primates, macaques and chimpanzees. So this is all done in the same way. It's all off brain size or skull, internal dimensions of the skull for individual skulls. This is the upper limit that you see in any primate in the world. You can see that at some point with the really with the appearance of our own genus, Homo here, things take off, and what's happening here is they're having to spend very large quantities of time engaged in social grooming, rising to around about 45% or so of the day being devoted to social grooming, which would be very pleasant and exciting for you, I'm sure. But actually, if you've got to earn your living or find food in the environment, is not possible. And you can see all the early fossil hominins, Australopithecines, are just performing it within primate levels. There's nothing special going on. But that huge increase here is really what we refer to as the bonding gap, because somehow they are managing to bond more individuals without having to spend the time. This is very obvious with humans. It turns out that if you look at modern human populations, we spend about 20% of our time engaged in social interaction with each other. So we're using the same limiting amount of time monkeys and apes do, but somehow bonding many other individuals. And the way we've done that essentially is to find a number of other behaviors, most of which are just, you know, behavioral discoveries. Then they're not genetically evolved to do this job, which also trigger the endorphin system. So the earliest one of those is laughter, which is the one that probably comes closest to being genetically determined, and which we share with great apes. And then there's singing and dancing, singing without words necessarily. And then finally, after the evolution of language, the rituals of religion, feasting, eating and drinking alcohol together. It's the alcohol that seems to be important, and telling stories, and particularly emotional stories. All of these turn out, we've shown, trigger the endorphin system and create a sense of bonding. Just to give you a sense of that, this is a composite of one set of experiments we did. We are using a pain threshold test here. We're testing a pain threshold. How much pain can you stand? You're doing an activity, in this case laughing, watching a video, and then we retest pain threshold. If endorphins are released, pain thresholds should increase across that. So here's 0, here's endorphin output has increased, down below 0, it's decreased. And this is 6 sets of or 5 sets of experiments in this particular graph. They're watching comedy stand-up video and then the control group are watching something interesting but boring, like golfing instruction videos, which don't laugh, nobody laughs at, right? And the answer is very nicely clear, that all the experiments with in which subjects are watching comedy and are laughing, they show an increase in endorphins, and all the neutral control videos are decreasing pain thresholds or sitting on the no change line. But there's a clear difference between all the experimental and control groups in every single case, and then our incredibly generous collaborators up in Finland and done the experiment in PET scanning with laughter, and here's the brain firing up in response to laughter. So it's just the contrast here is before watching the video and after watching the video, essentially. And this is just a composite of showing that not only have we shown the same effects across a variety of different things. So here's the data for laughter, here's data, whoops, for dancing, here's dancing with naltrexone control. This is the naltrexone control, no laughter. Well, they're laughing, but it's not kicking in the endorphin. Well, it's kicking in the endorphins, but the receptors aren't getting them, being able to absorb them, and there's a negative response. And in all these cases, you get this dramatic change in the sense of belonging to the group, of being bonded to the group, right across all of these. It's very clear. And just to finish up, one really the final step in the whole thing, I suppose, is who makes a good friend? And the answer, I'm afraid, is simply homophily. And that homophily, in other words, we pick our friends for their similarity to us, and the patterns on which we make those choices. I mean, there are a number of endogenous things. So gender is an important component, personality is an important component, ethnicity is an important component. But the really interesting one is what we call the 7 pillars of friendship, which are all cultural. So these are cultural dimensions on which we select and make the final selection of who should be our friends. And the more of this is kind of like a supermarket barcode that you speak, if you like. And the more of these dimensions you tick with somebody, the stronger the friendship is, and the more willing you are to be altruistic to them. And those 7 pillars are sharing the same language, or better still, dialect, and that's working at a very, very small local level. You know, the difference between the different dialects of Dutch, immediately you know this person doesn't come from your hometown. Again, reflecting that coming from the same place of origin, or we think that's really where you are socialized. That's more to do with teenage years, where you learn how to become a member of the community, same educational trajectory, having done the same subjects, maybe gone to the same university, the same hobbies and interests, the same worldview, moral views, religious views, political views, and then the 2 interesting ones, the same musical tastes and the same sense of humor. And our studies show very nicely that the more of these traits you share in common, the greater the emotional closeness to actual friends of yours. So these people are being told, think of your best friend, a male best friend, for example, in the 5 layer or in the 15 layer. And how many of these things do you share in common with them? And they're given about 21 different things, as it were. These 21 boil down to these 7 traits. Interestingly, the same musical tastes turns out to be one of the best predictors that people think will make a good friendship for strangers. I leave you to figure out why that should be. So just to sum up, the human social world is incredibly small scale. Its size is really determined by our brain's capacity to manage those relationships. Our social networks are highly structured, but also highly homophilous, and the layers themselves correspond to different numbers of those friendship dimensions. The structure is determined primarily by how we allocate our time so as to maximize the benefits, and friendships are underpinned by this dual process mechanisms, part of which involves the endorphin system in particular, and part of which involves social cognition, which is where the kind of these kind of cultural dimensions then come into place. So I shall stop there and go back to the main screen, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Well, thank you, Professor Dunbar, for such an interesting talk. And I think all the research that you covers really kind of highlights the importance of not just social interactions, but how integrated it is with our physiology as well. I think that's something that we've all realized during the pandemic, that online social interactions play a part in our social lives, but they're no substitute for the real thing. So yes, anyone has any questions, feel free to raise your Zoom hand in the reactions icon at the bottom of the screen. And Laura, would you like to go ahead?
Hi, Professor Dunbar. Thank you so much for your really engaging talk. I was really fascinated by your study showing that friendships are so fragile, and that's also what we see in adolescence, that friendships are really not this stable thing. They're more dynamic, they fluctuate. And I was wondering what role you think digital technology plays in our ability to maintain friendships, and especially in this now COVID world. Do you think that if you'd done that study now, would that change?
I'm going to say it wouldn't have changed a bit. One reason for saying that is that we see exactly the same patterns on Facebook as perhaps the least social of all the digital media you can think of, if you like. In other words, we don't have any cues except what you put on or type in. We see exactly the same patterns and the same frequencies of interaction across the layers. And secondarily, we did a study some years ago, which we asked a bunch of people to record at the end of every day all their interactions by whatever medium they used with their, I think it was their 8 best friends or something like that. It might have been 5 best friends. And to say how they felt about those interactions, how warm it made them feel, their sense of happiness, their sense of contentedness with those actual interactions that day. And they did that over a period of a couple of weeks, I think. And what that showed very clearly was that face-to-face interactions just came out way ahead. This was in the days before Zoom, so they only had Skype to play with. Skype wasn't bad. We were quite impressed by Skype. We expected it perhaps to be so clunky it wouldn't come out quite as well, but it actually came out nearly as well as face-to-face. But all the other digital media, phone calls, Facebook, texting, instant messaging, all those kind of standard things just came out way behind, and people clearly didn't get so much of a kick from them. We think that partly that the consequence is the processing, it's what we might think of as the flow of the conversation. When you're in a sort of multimodal environment, as in face-to-face, or perhaps Facebook or Zoom, Skype or Zoom, you're getting huge redundancy of information about what the person is thinking. Whereas if you're in a single mode medium, like a telephone where you've only got hearing or text-based ones, worse still, you're not really getting sufficient information about what's going on, and it causes these kind of awkward moments where nobody can think of anything to say. And that kind of works a little better with Facebook. In retrospect, and I think everybody's experience of Zoom in particular, since that's the one that's been used mostly over the pandemic, has been that it works okay up to a point. It works better with family than with friends somehow, because I think family can kind of tolerate the silences, on the one hand, and also tolerate the buttings in that go on, which would go on normally in a conversation, but they would kind of be lost in the background. They wouldn't be so intrusive. And I think the problem with video embedded digital media is simply that you are stuck with a maximum of 4 people who can actually communicate. In other words, there's this very, very strong limit on the number of people you can have in a conversation, or even who can laugh together at about 4 people. And anything beyond that, and what happens is people on the periphery, so it gets taken over by the people with the loudest voices usually, and then everybody else kind of sinks into the background, just becomes an onlooker, or gets distracted by their news feed or their email on their smartphone, and kind of lose track of what's going on. Whereas normally what would happen is those individuals would peel off and form a little conversation somewhere else. So I think you know, none of the digital media really have solved the problem of, they work very well and impressively so, but they're nowhere near as good in the end as being able to sit across the table from somebody in a bar or cafe or whatever and stare into the whites of their eyes and reach out and give them a hug. So, and I think that's what's been missing, you know, that people then began to realize that this is what they were actually missing. It was that intensely kind of subconscious processes that go on that they were not getting.
Thank you. I have more questions, but I see other people also have questions.
Maximilian, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, thank you so much for this super interesting presentation. I actually wanted to follow up on Anna-Laura's point, where wondering if we are not losing generational, interesting generational variation when we are not considering the ways of how, for example, young people communicate nowadays via social media. I'm thinking about expressing your emotions via emojis, for example, where young people might have very different types of expressions, and that may have a completely different impact later on their well-being and functioning. Now thinking about the lockdown situation. So I was wondering if you consciously kind of not necessarily linked your answer to Anna-Laura's question to kind of this developmental perspective, or yeah, I'm just curious.
Yep, no, it's a perfectly sensible question. And the answer is, I would say, well, at least we don't know, and maybe other people know who've looked at it. All I can say is we were obviously way ahead of our time, unintentionally, when we did this, you know, how good are your interactions with your various friends by different media study, which was done, you know, well over a decade ago. Because one of the things we included in there was laughter, whether that was done by literally laughter. So you had to say whether or not you'd had a bout of laughter during the course of the conversation, or whether the exchange, perhaps on text, had involved emojis of some kind, or, you know, LOLs, or, you know, whatever, smiley faces, or whatever emojis people were then using. And it was very clear that interactions which involved some kind of laughter were all experienced as more satisfying. But the frequencies are what differed between the different media. So you were clearly much more free to engage in laughter in face-to-face interactions, and much more likely to be common compared to on a text-based thing. And notoriously, you know, it's been known ever since the invention of email that jokes just don't work that well in text-based media. You know, things that you would fall off the bar stool laughing about, even when you're sober, in the bar, you kind of look at in the cold, hard light of black and white text and go, what planet is this guy on? You know, it's not funny at all. And you know, and that's partly because a lot of humor really is kind of more like slapstick. Yes, we use jokes to trigger humor, to kind of manage it so we can do it more often. But in fact, the best forms of humor are instantaneous. And that's reflected in the fact that laughter is extremely contagious. You know, somebody else, if the group you're with, the conversation you're in, starts laughing, you cannot help laughing. Even if somebody was telling a joke in Mongolian and you have no idea what it was about, if everybody else is laughing, you will laugh. You can't help it. But if another group on the other side of the pub is suddenly bursts out into laughter, you get incredibly offended. So who do these people think they are, you know, spoiling our conversation by laughing so much? It's a very personalized kind of almost, well, it's, you know, groups of 4 is the limit, it turns out, from our data anyway, from several different sources. And that's the same limit on size of conversation. So they're very intimate kind of groupings, and it's about the kind of, I don't know, it's the engaging of minds, if you like, as much as anything, but it doesn't have to have conversation. That's the interesting thing about laughter, and probably is reflecting the fact that it is very, very ancient. We share it with the great apes. That, you know, it's like a form of chorusing, which we can kind of trigger with jokes, but it doesn't actually require a joke to do it. So, you know, that's why kind of in the right context, bad jokes work extremely well. You know, there's no merit in trying to be a clever comedian if it's with your friends. You know, you just have to make them laugh. That's all. So yes, you know, there are clearly lots of interesting differences, and the interesting differences will be to see how over the course of, let's say, the next decade, these things kind of are processed and were in the context of the, you know, generations coming behind us old folks.
Thank you. Thanks.
Well, Klaus, would you like to ask your question next?
Okay, thank you very much for a very interesting and fascinating talk. I have actually a question about your number of 150, and especially you had some examples to show that it is about 150, and one of them is the telephone calls. And it's not so much that I'm interested in the mean, but more about the variation around this mean. So that is quite huge. And so you make your comparisons also with different species and brain size and this number. But if you look within the species, and for humans, you have this nice data set from the telephones, and you can also measure brain sizes within humans. So is the same relationship within species present? And what does it mean that some people have apparently a number which is much higher than 150 and others much lower than 150? Does it imply there is also natural selection going on? And maybe this may be a stupid question because I'm a plant ecologist and had nothing to do with human behavior, but it struck me.
Yeah, well, you all know better than anybody else that in biology, there is no such thing as a stupid question.
Thank you. Yeah.
That all questions cause us to reflect on our assumptions and end up allowing us to move to a new, more interesting dimension that we've overlooked. The short answer is, I mean, there is wide variation within humans, and in fact, the range of variation is what you'd predict from the social brain hypothesis. The social brain hypothesis equations predict a range of variation from about 1 to 200 or so. And that's exactly what you see in, actually, I think the original prediction was 1 to 250 because it's on a log scale. So the upper end was slightly bigger, with an average about 150. And that's on all our databases. That's just pretty much exactly what you see. So the range of variation typically is somewhere between 100 and 200 in humans. We know what affects a lot of that variability. As I mentioned, at least as far as the structure of networks, perhaps not so much the size itself. Girls tend to have bigger networks than boys. The big difference is boys tend to tip over into, on Facebook, tends to be the boys that go for the big numbers on the whole. And what's interesting about those kind of media is precisely the fact that Facebook, for example, is trying to avoid you limiting the number of friends you have listed for their business model. They want you to have lots of contacts so that their algorithms, for advertising and so on, will spread far and wide. So it's very inconvenient for you to limit the number of friends to your true friends and family on Facebook, even though that's what everybody does. But in fact, because they offer you the opportunity, they set a limit originally of 5,000. And I think that's still true. And of course, a few people do. But what they're doing is they're simply dipping out into the layers beyond, into the 500 layer and the 1500 layer, in just exactly the same way as we do in everyday life. So there's kind of nothing new going on there. In terms of other species, so there is an important distinction between the variation within species and the variation between species, in the sense that the variation within species is just the natural variation that you would expect to see in any biological species. So some of it is due to personality differences, we know that. Some of it is due to gender, so on. All these kind of standard psychological things. You see the same kind of distribution within other species too, at least within the primates. Remember, this is a primate peculiar phenomenon. There have been 2 neuroimaging studies, one by one of the Oxford groups, Jerome Selle and Roger Mars group, looking at macaques, and then a French group have looked at baboons, and both of them have shown that core areas of the brain, particularly those associated with the limbic system and the default mode network units, correlate with the size of the groups that the animals are housed in. So these are housed in groups, but the housings are kind of consequence of long-term movement of individuals around to try and get groups that don't end up fighting too much. So the animals are kind of indirectly making the choice, as it were, for the group sizes that are comfortable from their point of view, I suppose you might think of. So there's some clear indication there that that's okay. And what the Oxford group have shown is that all these core areas that come up out of the neuroimaging studies in humans as being correlated with group size and with the social cognitive skills on which relationships depend are there in certainly the old world monkeys and apes in particular, the Cercopithecine monkeys, the very social monkeys and apes. They're there, and we just have it on a bigger scale. So, I suppose I would kind of, I always have one foot in zoology because that's where I kind of came from, as well as one foot in psychology. But the evolutionary process it seems to me just to be the natural one. You've got variation, and something is driving brain size up. That something is the need to have bigger and bigger bonded groups as a result, not just for the sake of it, but to solve an ecological problem. And that ecological problem principally is predation risk, because these things all correlate. The size of groups and indeed the cognitive abilities that different species of primates have correlate with the predator riskiness of the environments that they live in. And as with all these things, you then got consequences that emerge out of that selection process, because it doesn't come for free. Brains are extremely expensive energetically. Partly because of the cost of replenishing neurotransmitters all the time. And therefore you have constraints, which are the costs that selection operates against, that have to be resolved somehow. And those costs are largely energetic costs. So you find corresponding changes in diet, shifts to diets, either more time spent feeding or to shift to diets which are more digestible and therefore allow you to process nutrients faster. So your nutrient throughput is maximized in order to allow you to have a bigger brain, so that you can it can support cognitively the complex business of trying to maintain cohesion in these large, otherwise unstable groups, or groups that would be unstable if they were non-primates.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, we better wrap up this general Q&A session, but thank you for all your questions, and of course Professor Dunbar for his thought-provoking Sylvius lecture and insightful discussion. And thank you to everyone for attending. For those of you who registered an interest, do stay on the call for the special session with Robin, or if there was anyone who was really keen to ask a question that they didn't have a chance, you can stay on as well. Thank you.